Hello and welcome to the MFA Visual Narrative Storyteller series. I'm Nathan Fox, chair of the MFA Visual Narrative program here at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. The MFA Visual Narrative program is the first low residency multimedia graduate program of its kind and is most definitely a bold alternative to traditional storytelling and MFA programs. We do so by recognizing that a command of story is the most powerful and fundamental foundation an artist in any creative profession can have and possess. Our educational mission is to inspire all students to harness their collective creative writing and visual development skills and empower our graduates to be the next generation of transformative, relevant, and original content creators. I'm very proud to have our students, staff, and faculty here with us this evening, and more than overjoyed to be back on campus and working with you all once more. Thank you. For those interested in learning more about the MFA Visual Narrative program, our faculty, or following our students' work as they develop and grow, please visit us at mfavn.sva.edu, follow us online, at MFAVN, or feel free to drop us an email at mfavn@sva.edu. I am honored to be here tonight to kick off the Storytellers series with faculty member, author, and lecturer Jonathan Gottschall. I first discovered Jonathan's work while doing research for one of my own classes in 2013, the year we launched the MFAVN program, as well as the year Jonathan's book, The Storytelling Animal, hit the shelves. So it is both a joy to have him here with us this evening, as well as a privilege and honor to welcome him as faculty and to the SVA community at large. Praised by Stephen Pinker as our deepest thinker about the powerful role of stories in our lives, Gottschall is a distinguished fellow in the English department at Washington and Jefferson College. His writing at the intersection of science and art has been covered in depth by the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine, Scientific American, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Oprah Magazine, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Science, Nature, and on shows like Radiolab, Morning Edition, and National Geographic's Star Talk with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Jonathan is the author or editor of 8 books, including The Storytelling Animal, How Stories Make Us Human, The Professor in the Cage, Why Men Fight, Why We Like to Watch, and his recent book, The Story Paradox, How Our Love of Storytelling Builds Societies and Tears Them Down, which is about a dark, The Story Paradox, How Our Love of Storytelling Builds Societies and Tears Them Down, which is a book about the dark side of humanity's storytelling instincts. A quick reminder, please silence your phones and remote devices. We are recording this evening's lecture for posting on SVA's YouTube channel. When we get to the Q&A, please wait for the handheld microphone to be passed around when you ask your questions. This is to provide audio for those listening on this recording. You will not be on camera. So with that, and without further ado, please welcome Jonathan Gottschall.
Okay. Well, thanks for that introduction, Nathan. And thanks for all of you guys being here. Thanks especially to my students who've already had 3 hours of this garbage today. And now you're facing another hour and a half of me time. So I apologize for that. You guys don't even know what I look like after all this time. I've had the mental. Okay, so I wrote a book called The Storytelling Animal 10 years ago. It came out. I was much more optimistic then about the role of stories in human life. I had it was a sort of celebratory book. It was a book very much looking at the bright side of storytelling. It was a different era. Most of that book was written in the aughts, like 2009, 2010. The research was done by then. The book is written in 2010, 2011. It comes out in 2012 after sitting in the can for about a year. And it reflected a different time. Social media was still in its infancy. Most people still didn't have, smartphones in their pockets. There was a lot of technological utopianism. We thought the internet and social media were going to be really wonderful forces for human prosperity and peace and liberation and freedom and education. And things haven't really turned out that way. And by the time I got ready to write The Story Paradox, I was in a very different mood about the power of storytelling in human life. And I was actually feeling a little guilty about the role I had played as a sort of, how people had read The Storytelling Animal as a book about that said that stories were good. And I never thought that stories were good. I just thought stories were powerful, and they had equal capacity to do harm or good. So if The Storytelling Animal was about this sort of hackneyed question, how can we use stories to save the world? The Story Paradox was asking a different question. How can we, instead of using stories to save the world, how can we save the world from stories? Because I'm making the argument that stories are really a major force of division in our lives. Okay, so without further ado, let's launch into this thing. We'll warm up. Oh, I want to say one more thing. That whole prelude, who saw the? I know Nathan says that in his classes he sometimes showed a TED Talk that I do. Has everyone seen that TED Talk, or a lot of you guys have seen that TED Talk? Okay, it doesn't matter if you've seen it or not. I just wanted to alert you that there will be a couple of slides in here that should be familiar from that. I showed them in every talk, but I'll be coming at them from a different perspective. So one thing I was doing in this book was I was looking at some of the same data, but through not through the same rose-colored lenses, perhaps, that I used in the previous book. Okay, so we'll warm up here with a few stories. Story number one is a humorous type of folk tale that comes down to us today through a living and vigorous modern tradition of oral storytelling. So remember, I'm going to tell you this story, but it has actual educational value. And the story goes like this. Once upon a time, a man walks into a bar. Now again, don't stop me if you've heard this. I know some of you guys have heard this. But that you've heard it, it's actually kind of the part of the point. This is a story that's been circulating for almost 100 years. As an oral folk tale that has been spread around just because people like it so much and they like the effect that it produces. Once upon a time, a man walks into a bar. Let's say the man's name is Fred. He sees his best friend sitting at the bar. His best friend is looking down at the tabletop where there's this very small man playing this very small piano very beautifully. This is a classic old joke, all right? Fred walks up to his friend. He says, wow, he's so small and he's so good at playing the piano. Where'd he come from? And his friend doesn't even look up. He just gives a sort of distracted wave and he says, well, there's a genie out behind the bar and he's giving away wishes. And Fred runs out there because he wants some of this. And so he gets out there, and sure enough, there's this genie in the alleyway, and he says, Genie, will you please grant my wish? I'd like $1 million. And the genie looks at him for a moment, then he nods his head, and there's this flash of light. And when Fred can open his eyes again, he's kind of dazzled. The whole alleyway is filled not with $1 million. Did I even say what he asked for? Okay. I've drank a lot of coffee just now, and so I completely like stroked out for a moment. And so the genie so he opens his eyes, and instead of finding the $1 million he asked for, he sees $1 million ducks. There's $1 million ducks in the alleyway. He runs back into the alleyway, into the bar, and he says to his friend, he says, can you believe that stupid genie? I ask him for $1 million, he gives me $1 million ducks. And at this point, his friend finally looks up, and there's a tear rolling down his cheek, and he's been crying, and he says, yeah, do you really think I asked the genie for a 12-inch pianist? That's an old joke. It's kind of a groaner. I'm kind of ashamed whenever I tell it. But it's the only joke I know. And I do have a point about it. In fact, I have 2 points about it. I'll get to the most important point, the real punchline, a little bit later in the talk. The secondary point I'll get to now is simply to highlight the fact that jokes are stories. When we tell each other jokes, we're telling each other these small, funny, usually fictional stories. And when we see a stand-up comedian, we're seeing a virtuoso oral story performer at work. And I think jokes are one of these really cool examples of the way that story infiltrates almost everything that humans do, but in ways we're often not aware of. Story number 2 is called A Girl Walks into a Forest. And it's a short story, improvised and performed off the cuff by this little genius named Claire. And let's see if we can make this actually work. I'll go over here. And we'll listen to Claire's story. Ready? This goes on for about an hour. Sorry, an hour. Too much coffee. A minute.
Well, once upon a time, I was walking in the jungle, and I stopped. And when I stopped, I just heard 2 snapping branches. But then I knew I was surrounded with hungry bears and coyotes, and one of the biggest coyotes and bear grabbed me, and I did the double eye poke, and that made them startled. And they let go of me, and then I went as fast as I could until I got to my truck and drove home, and I did, and then when I drove home to my mommy and daddy.
And so you were safe?
Yes.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
And the bear and coyote never found me again.
I love that little girl. I don't know if you guys noticed, or if you, there's a little bit of an audio issue there where, she's 3, and so it might not have been clear, but do you hear how she got out of this scenario when the coyotes are closing in on her, what she did? Anybody hear it? Yeah, she gives the double eye poke. That's how she solved this problem. All right, so let's see if I can get, F3, and we'll go back into this. All right, so little children, like Claire, play at story by instinct. Their skills in storytelling and pretend play, these evolve in regular developmental stages, just like their skill in walking or talking or any other natural task. By the time a little girl like Claire is 3, she's mastered already the basic way of structuring a story. This is sort of a basic, stripped-down structure of how a story might be organized. You have a character, a hero, they have a problem, there's villains to confront, there's victims to save. She kind of has a natural grasp of this, and she also has a expert sense, pretty much, for how to build a story builds tension and then releases it with a climactic and crowd-pleasing sort of ending. And as Claire grows into a woman, she'll live all day in stories, fiction stories, nonfiction stories, everything that lies in between. And even when her body takes its rest at night, what will her brain do? It will stay awake the night long, telling itself the stories we call dreams. So the argument is that Homo sapien, wise person, that's a pretty good definition for our species. But Homo fictus, fiction person, story person, that might be an even better definition. Human beings are storytelling animals. Let me give you a sense for what I mean. This is a slide that you would have seen from my earlier talk. But again, we'll have a slightly different perspective on it. Story number 3 was created in the 1940s by 2 psychologists. The psychologists were named Heider-Simmel. And I apologize to my class because we've already talked about this. But they made this very short, very crude animated film. They show it to 120 people. And at the end of the film, they simply asked the viewers, what did you see? And right now what we can do is we'll watch this, and I'll ask you guys that question at the end. We'll try to replicate this famous experiment. We'll watch it, and we'll see, I'll ask you guys what you saw. And we'll basically kind of respond with a show of hands. So let's watch this little film now. Okay, real famous experiment from 1944. This was published, and it's still really relevant and heavily cited even today. So I asked you what you saw, and I'll just ask a few questions here. Maybe you guys can respond with a show of hands. So who saw a story here of some type? Your mind populates with some sort of story. Just about everybody. That always happens. Who interpreted the triangles and the circles as humans? Who anthropomorphizes these things? And generally what will happen is the more questions I ask, the more hands will fall down. So still a majority of people are anthropomorphizing. This one is always interesting to me. Who gendered the shapes? Who gendered them specifically in this way? Male triangles, circular female. Who does that? Okay, maybe half of them. Did somebody gender I've always been curious about this. Did anybody gender it the opposite way? Circular male and triangular female? Okay, I told my class I'd never heard anybody say that before. So that's very cool. But there's endless diversity in the way that people see this film. So that's very cool. I'm actually glad to see that. Who saw the big triangle as the bad guy of the story? Okay. Again, usually it's about more than half. And there's usually a minority of people who I ask this question and they say yes. Did anyone see the big triangle as the good guy? Good guy, yes. So there's a few hands. And finally, what I would like to do now is just get a little bit of feedback from people, not from people in my class, because we already know the stories that you guys saw, but from other people in the room, just to say in like 2 sentences so we can hear from a bunch of people, what was the story that you saw? Is anybody willing to volunteer that? Sure, thank you.
In my mind, the gender projection was the big one was male and the smaller shapes were female. And it was an almost Bakhtinian subversion and containment of patriarchal power.
Okay, all right. That is psychologically complex, man. But it's cool how a lot of people really do get a pretty complex and rich story out of this. But that's a fairly common reading of it. In class today, I said that when I hear this one, I often call that in the responses in that category the bad daddy narrative. Some sort of abusive male authority figure.
I'll try mine. So kind of almost like a Dennis the Menace style. I mean, I guess you say good guy, but like the neighbor who lives in his house and the neighbor kids come and they're picking on him and they torment him until he gets so mad that he just leaves his house.
Yeah, that's a common one too. Yeah, absolutely. So when people do see him as the good guy, it's usually that he's just minding his own business in his house and these Lilliputian invaders come and terrorize him for no reason. A couple more? Just 2 more, let's say. Yeah.
I saw a big triangle as like a monster that had escaped its cage and was picking on the other shapes.
Okay. Yeah. So a monster escaping his cave, picking on these other shapes. Does anyone see this narrative? This is a narrative that I always saw. And in fact, when I saw it, I was convinced this was the true narrative. I was like, people would say, when I first showed it to my students, in fact, I expected them to see what I saw. And when they didn't see it, I was like, what's wrong with you? So what I saw, and this actually is statistically the most common thing to see, was basically a love triangle story. Big triangle is sort of the villain, and the other 2 are the lovers, and he's trying to split them apart. He's jamming his wedge-shaped nose and moving them away, and he's assaulting the male. And at some point, he gets the female, and again, this is my story, he gets the female into that little house, and he kind of chases her around in there, and thank goodness she escapes out, and then they run around the house, and then they run for it. Who sees something like that, a sort of love story? Okay, just a few people. In the original, it was about half of people saw that story. So this is cool. I love this experiment. That's why I keep showing it. I always show it. And we never fail to replicate the original experiment. So in the original, only a very, very tiny percentage, I think 3 of the 120 people, gave a truly reasonable, rational, logical, Vulcan, Spock-like response. What did I see? I saw triangles, circles, they're moving around on a blank screen. That's all I saw. I saw geometry. But everybody else, 98, 99% of people see some sort of story, some sort of classic story structure. They see something like that. Okay? Maybe it doesn't fit into it perfect, but something like this. They see a drama of the good guys up against the bad. They see these little love triangles, these little doors slamming. They see witches. They see monsters, abusive parents. They see, like me, a sexual predator. They see little soap operas, little comedies, little tragedies. And what I like about this experiment is it reveals us, it catches us in the act as natural interpreters and natural creators of stories. It's not just that all of you would be capable. If I asked you to take those raw, crude, geometrical cues and turn them into a story, you could all do that. You're all storytellers. That would be easy for you. What's happening here is more interesting than that. It's that most of us watch this and we can't not do it. We can't help ourselves. We do it automatically. It's a neurological reflex. We do it without even trying. It's just how our minds work as storytelling animals. And it's important, and I think it's really quite beautiful, that we're definitely not all seeing the same story here. If we were all seeing the same story, it would mean that we were just really good at digesting a narrative that the psychologists are feeding to us. The fact that we're seeing different stories here means that when you watch that, you're not experiencing a story. You're not viewing a story. You are the one who is creating the story. You're making the story. And again, automatically, reflexively, on the fly, without even trying, it's how your mind works as a storytelling animal. And isn't it wonderful that we are storytelling animals? Because stories do a huge amount of good in the world, as absolutely no one doubts, least of all me. And just think of what a wasteland life would be of meaning and of pleasure without stories to tell and stories to read and watch and listen to. And yet humanity's love affair with storytelling is so intense and so ardent and so unconditional that we're often blind to its darker side. So, story number 4. I will try to make this darkness visible by telling you story number 4, which is a truly sad and tragic and awful story. And it's a story of how I decided to write this book when I was standing in this crowd in the fall of 2018. And we had gathered, all of us here, in a vigil because a man had plunged down an internet rabbit hole where he had learned that Jews were the great vampires of history. And there was no one with him down the hole to explain to him that the story wasn't true, that it was just a real mean fiction. And so, believing the story as he did, he made the short drive to the leafy, prosperous Pittsburgh suburb of Squirrel Hill, not very far from where I live. He enters the Tree of Life Synagogue, and he shoots it up, screaming, "All Jews must die." He kills 11 people, he wounds many more, and it's all because he's living inside this very old and very dumb fiction story about Jewish evil. And from inside that story, what he does makes a demented sort of sense. And standing in that crowd, I was overwhelmed by the truly awesome power story has to derange our minds and drive us towards madness. And so I began working on a book about the following paradox, the story paradox, that stories are simply the very best and most constructive force in human life, and at the very same time, they're also the very worst and most destructive force in human life. And so when you become a storyteller, you're wielding immense power, and you can misuse it, either on purpose or inadvertently, much more likely to be inadvertent. I am far from the first to worry about the dark side of stories. Fully 2,400 years ago, this guy Plato already had his hair on fire about stories' capacity to derange our minds and to badly harm society. And he came up with an interesting solution to the problem. I think maybe you've heard about it before. He said, well, let's just round up all the storytellers, including definitely all you guys. Let's march them out to the edge of town and we'll fling them over the city wall. We'll banish them, we'll burn all their books, we'll denude the society of the noxious influence of storytellers, easy peasy. He backs off. He comes up with a different idea. But Plato was mainly worried about the dangerous influence of playwrights and poets. What would he say about today's world, where we're living inside a technologically driven big bang of storytelling? This shockingly, I mean truly shockingly rapid expansion of the universe of stories in every conceivable direction. It's to the point now, and I actually have trouble getting this statistic out of my mouth because it's such a big number. It's to the point now where the average American, according to Nielsen, it consumes 12 hours of media per day, mostly in narrative form, including more than 4 hours just through the TV alone. We're living in stories all day long. And it's these clashing stories, conspiracy stories, ideological stories, slanted news stories, misinformation and disinformation stories spread on the internet, and all the rest that are driving the world mad in both senses of the word. They're drawing us into these epidemics of intense irrationality. And they are revving up our rage and our mutual hostility. And so this brings us to story 5. This is the one we're all living inside right now. A story where one day we woke up to find ourselves in the center of all this story-driven turmoil, the epidemics of irrationality and rage, the huge and escalating culture war over the true story of American history, the true story of race relations, the true narratives around COVID-19 or the Black Lives Matter movement or January 6th or gender expression and so on and so on and so on. In this talk, you'll have my best attempt to explain the science between not just the positive power of storytelling, but also the perils of storytelling and what people like us, storytellers, might do to help cut through the chaos. And you've already seen Skeptical Hippo here. So if you're feeling a little skeptical right now of everything I'm saying, that's fine and fair. But if you feel skeptical of the idea that narrative is as powerful as I'm suggesting, let alone as dangerous as I'm suggesting, you aren't alone. You can bring people. Psychologists have done this. They bring people into a lab, and you can ask them, and they'll say that stories have very little influence over them. And what they respect, what sways their belief and their decisions, are facts, stats, science, hard empirical evidence. But with respect, they're wrong. So let me explain. Communicators can generally make use of one of two communication strategies. They can rationalize by deploying arguments and backing it up with evidence, or they can dramatize by telling stories. And studies clearly show that when it comes to just about any outcome a communicator might care about, for instance, do people enjoy my message? Do people pay attention to my message? Are they persuaded by my message? Do they remember my message? And perhaps most importantly, do they amplify my message by spreading it around themselves through their social networks? The science shows that dramatization reliably beats rationalization and beats it by a lot. This is all tied into one of the most important concepts in this emerging science of storytelling that I'm writing about. And the concept is narrative transportation. It's probably a term you've come across. And narrative transportation is that delicious sense. You know, it's one of the best parts of being human. That experience of opening up a book or turning on the TV and mentally teleporting out of your own boring, mundane, perhaps quite painful reality and into an alternative story world. And it can be the story world of a blockbuster film like, you know, the one starring Denzel, or it can be an art house documentary, or it can be a story that you have in the paranoid fantasies of QAnon, which is a highly narratively transporting narrative. To a lot of people it seems crazy, but if you're in this story, you've suspended your disbelief, you're transported by it, and you are you're in. So narrative transportation is an authentically altered state of consciousness. It's like taking a drug. It's a state of highly focused attention. We're different. That's what I'm saying. We're different when we're narratively transported than we are in normal conscious life. It's a highly focused state of attention, and it's also, importantly, a state of high suggestibility. We're more open-minded when we're in Storyland, which sounds really good. But that also means that we're a lot more gullible. We're much more vulnerable to being molded and to being manipulated. Which brings me back very quickly to the real punchline of this dumb little joke I told. Have you ever wondered why public speakers, like me, often start off with a story? Almost always they start off with a story. And the most hackneyed way to get started is to tell a little joke. And jokes are interesting because, as Chris Rock knows, there's always risk in telling a joke. A risk of giving offense or just bombing. I've told that joke many times and just bombed. In fact, it usually bombs, kind of. But occasionally it doesn't. And I always feel nervous telling that joke. I actually do. I almost always play with the idea of just censoring it out because of the dangers of telling jokes. There's risk in it. Everyone's sensitivities are quite raw right now, and few of us are in a very forgiving sort of mood. And I have given this talk before, and people have been offended by it, and have written the conference organizer and said, "This man reminded me of the fact that humans have genitals." That's as bad as the joke is, right? That's all it does. I mean, it doesn't even say the word, but So if there's risk in it, why do you do it? Why do you tell the joke? And the most, again, hackneyed explanation for this, well, it breaks the ice. And what does that mean? I don't know what it means, but I do know that what you're trying to do when you're a public speaker and you tell that joke is you're trying to manipulate the audience. You're trying to manipulate them. You're trying to get the messaging advantages that are tied to narrative transportation. When you are up on stage and that joke actually works, you can practically feel the energy in the room change as people in the crowd sort of uncross their arms and open up their minds, and they warm up to you, and you kind of hear their intellectual armor clattering to the ground. It just changes the whole vibe, and it makes it easier to get your points across. In other words, people tell these jokes because they help transform an audience from that skeptical hippo mode into hippos who have succumbed either a little or a lot to the spell of narrative transportation. Is this still a current meme? Or is it really old? Is it really old? You ever seen this meme before? Is this a meme? It's a perennial? What'd you say? Perennial. Okay, yeah. I feel very old. I really do. I really do. The whole time I'm in class, I'm just screwing up the technology all the time, and I feel like I'm being judged, and I don't really know if that's a meme or not. Okay, so I don't know if I should go into this or not. I guess I'll go into it. So we have this authentically altered state of consciousness that happens with narrative transportation. That's what a storyteller is trying to achieve. It's sort of the most basic goal is to achieve this altered state of consciousness, because that's where all the power lies. The power to give pleasure, but also the power to wield influence, to actually move people in a direction intellectually, emotionally, morally that you think they should move. And there's some kind of cool neuroscience that gives some insight into how this works. You can take a person, you slide them into an fMRI machine that can watch the brain while the brain watches the story, or read the brain while the brain reads a story. And if you do that, you find something interesting. The brain doesn't look like a passive spectator on the action, like it's kind of sitting back passively and watching someone else. And you're watching someone else go through these experiences and have these emotions. But that's not what it looks like to your brain. Your brain looks more like an active participant in the action. Like you're the one going through these actions and having these emotions. So if Clint Eastwood is up on screen and he's angry, and he's always angry, right? Your brain looks angry too. If the scene is sad, your brain looks sad too. And let me illustrate this with another video clip. This one is from the horror franchise Paranormal Activity. I love this ad campaign because it shows you what's happening on the screen, but it also turns the camera around. You guys have seen these ads, great trailers. And it shows you the effect that the movie is having on the crowd.
Did you hear that?
What the heck? You hear that? Did you hear that?
What's that sound?
There's something in here with this guy.
Here.
Katie.
Paranormal Activity 3, rated R, October 21st.
So I love that because we're so used to that we're so used to that kind of response that we've lost sight of how incredibly bizarre that is. That is so bizarre. At a conscious level, everybody in that theater knows that everything they're seeing in that film is totally fake. The monsters, the blood, the danger, everything they're seeing is just light dancing on a two-dimensional background. And everyone in the theater knows this for a dead certainty. No one's confused about this. But these film viewers aren't only treating the fake stuff like it's real, they're acting like they're participants in the action. Not observers, just as these brain imaging studies suggest they would. Why else would they be doing those little dances in their seats, right? They're sort of avoiding the blow, they're avoiding the knife. They're screaming, they're screaming out for help, is what people do when they're in serious danger. My favorite moment in that whole trailer, I don't know if you guys saw it, but there's this moment where everybody in the frame, like 6, 7, 8 people, all at the same time, pull in their elbows and draw in their knees. They're balling up, to protect their vital organs. Their brains are telling their bodies to do all the things that they would do if they were actually under a mortal threat. So I love this clip in conjunction with this research because it suggests that stories are so powerful for us, at least in part, because whatever is happening on the stage or the screen or the page isn't just happening to them. It isn't just happening to the characters. At a sort of basic, deep brain level, it's happening to us as well. We may know the story is fake. In fact, we always know the story is fake if it's fiction. But that doesn't stop deep, unconscious parts of our brain from processing it as though it's real. And along the way, the stories we consume are strongly shaping our attitudes, our hopes, our fears, our values, very often for the better, very often. For example, this is one cool line of research. Research shows that popular TV shows can reorganize our attitudes on a grand scale. Shows featuring likable characters from different groups. We have examples here of Monk, Different Strokes, Will and Grace, the Canadian sitcom, which is popular in Canada, but maybe most people haven't seen it here, called Little Mosque on the Prairie. And there's many more from all over the world, have been shown to significantly and lastingly reduce bias toward the mentally ill, African Americans, gay people, and Muslims, respectively. And by the way, there's no need whatsoever for explicit political messaging in any of these stories. That's not how they work. This show does not work by having bigots come to New York and beat up Will and Jack. That's not how they do it. All they have to do is show that Will and Jack are nice guys and funny, and we start to like them. And we say, you know what? Maybe they aren't as scary as I was raised to believe. I actually like these guys, and we sort of transfer our views of the fictional characters to real-life people. That seems to be how it works. And the more explicit the messaging is actually, the more likely it is to backfire, the less likely it is to work. They're like, oh, wait a second. I was enjoying this show, but it turns out it's just, progressive propaganda. Click off. So there's a neuroscientist named Paul Zak who shows how all of this is working at a brain level. So he pays research subjects $20. They're students, and it's important they're students because, like most of you, they're poor. And it's important that these are cash-strapped kids. So he pays them $20, and he gives them a sad and compelling non-fictional story to read about a father, and this is sad, and his terminally ill son. He takes a little blood before they read and a little blood after they read. And at the end of the study, the students are given the option. Say, hey man, no pressure, but if you like, you can donate some of that money we just paid you back to a charity that serves kids who are sick with this kind of really nasty cancer. And after reading, so here's the results. After reading the story, blood samples showed spikes of oxytocin. Oxytocin has been called the empathy chemical. And the more oxytocin there was in the blood, the more these cash-strapped, empathy-drunk students donate back to the charity that serves sick kids. On average, they give back half of their pay. It's a pretty significant donation. And what's cool about this study is it suggests that stories are changing our behaviors, changing our values, changing our minds about things by actually modifying our brain chemistry. There's just more of this chemical in our brains. But Paul Zak stresses, as do I, that the information about this sick kid, it has to be delivered within a classic story structure. If you just spray this information at the students with bullet points, and it's not within the story structure, you don't get the chemical changes in the brain. You don't get the eruption of empathy, and you don't get the behavior change. You don't get that donation. You don't get any of that stuff unless you tap into this special power that you guys are learning to wield. This special power storytellers have to rivet our attention, to rouse us emotionally, and to change how we think and how we feel and how we act. And this all leads into story 6, which is the rosiest story we tell about ourselves as storytelling animals. You've all heard this story before. And it's a story where stories themselves are celebrated, lionized, put up on a pedestal by everybody, by English teachers, by great artists, by thought leaders of various kinds, and also by research scientists for the way they excite powerful empathy. Stories, we are assured, teach us to behave more humanly toward all types of humans. But this feel-good story is precisely and only half true, which means that it's also half false. It's half fiction, and it's not the sort of fiction that does anyone any good. This half-true story takes account of all the warm feelings of empathy and connection storytellers can generate, while honestly not even seeming to notice that a contrary energy is circulating very fast and very hard through the stories that we love, and it wouldn't be far wrong to call that energy hate. Insofar as a classically told story, a story that is basically following something like that structure, divides the world into good people, heroes, protagonists, and bad people, antagonists, villains. They generate 1 unit of callousness for every unit of empathy. Put differently, in the very act of generating empathy for protagonists and for victims, storytellers are simultaneously producing an extreme dulling of empathy that allows us to revel in the sufferings of villains for whoever the storyteller forces into the villain's role. We hate the bad guy of stories. We oftentimes really, really hate them. And research shows that people get more satisfaction out of stories in which offenders are punished, often in really hideous ways. They're vaporized, they're killed painfully, they're socially humiliated in really devastating sorts of ways. People like those types of stories better than stories where the bad guy is forgiven at the end. This all makes storytelling the ideal tool, not only for bringing us together, but also for driving us apart, for for giving us that on the left, but also for giving us that on the right. So this is a difficult thing to face, I think. But atrocities are less likely to be driven by a total lack of empathy than by a twisted version of story-generated empathy itself. So take the Tree of Life shooter, who was radicalized in middle age. The conspiracy story he believed in filled him with hate, yes, but it also drenched him in empathy about a slow-motion genocide he believed were being prosecuted against his people, against white people, Gentile whites. And here is the infamous final message the shooter posted to social media before opening fire. He said, HIAS, the Hebrew International Aid Society, likes to bring in invaders that kill our people. They're settling refugees, by the way. That's what he's referring to. Likes to bring in invaders that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. And here's what the killer was saying. I'm not stupid. I know it doesn't look good. I know the optics aren't good here of shooting up, a bunch of mostly geriatric worshipers. But look closer, he's saying. I'm not the monster. I'm the good guy. I'm the hero who sacrifices everything to slay the monsters. That's a very common story to tell. It's the same story we hear about the war in Ukraine. Because of this informational iron curtain that Putin has managed to encircle his country with, the only story most Russians are able to hear about the war is that they simply have no ethical alternative whatsoever but to confront this evil Nazi regime, which is hell-bent on committing genocide against ethnic Russians living in Ukraine. So here's what Putin is saying. He's saying, look, I know it doesn't look good. I know the optics aren't good here, bombing this neighboring country to rubble, terrorizing and murdering its citizens. But look closer. We're not the monsters, we're the heroes who risk everything to slay the monsters. And if you think back to this Heider-Simmel experiment, its significance actually has nothing to do with how our minds happen to respond to simple animation. Rather, this is what our minds are doing all the time, every day of our lives as storytelling animals. We're trying to impose this meaningful and comforting order of story structure on all the chaos of our existence. We're trying to turn this sort of chaos into that, this simple, concrete, coherent, and comforting and meaningful structure. But we have to remember that when we look out upon the world, just as with the Heider-Simmel experiment, we're not all going to see the same story. The stories we see will be partially determined in a Rorschach-like way by our personality differences and the biases of our experiences, our religion, our politics, our identities, and so forth. And I think this is part of what's going on right now, is that we're living inside a real-life, real-time Heider-Simmel experiment, where basically decent and intelligent people look out on the world and they see the same chaotic footage about protests or elections or viruses or about cultural change, and yet they resolve it into radically different movies. Same footage, edited together into different movies with crisscrossed heroes and crisscrossed villains and diametrically opposed morals of the story. And I'm getting very close to the end. Which brings us to our last story, which is something like this. How do we as storytellers and as citizens help co-author a story of the future that is better than the past and spares us from a myriad of cataclysms that seem to be hovering over us? I'm going to give you two suggestions here of my own. These strike me as quite humble in comparison to the scale of the challenges we face, but they have this going for them. You can start doing these things right now, today. You don't have to wait for someone to give you any permission. So the first suggestion is, coming to speak to you today, I was sitting on the subway and I had this sort of nightmarish image of you guys politely sitting in the audience and listening to my talk and nodding along happily as you tick off all the way. My points apply perfectly to all the narratives you don't like and all the people you don't like, your crazy uncle, some news pundit that you despise, while never thinking to turn that skepticism around on yourselves. So I think if we're going to be good citizens, the first thing we need to do is cultivate a habit of skepticism toward our own narratives, not just the other guys or the other sides. We have to realize that none of this is a them problem. This is an us problem, as in it's an everyone problem. We all have a tendency to get misled in sometimes dangerous and sometimes destructive ways by narrative. And I know very few people, no matter how intelligent, no matter how well educated, who are brave enough to seriously ask the question, how have I been led astray by stories? What fictions am I lost inside? Second recommendation may surprise you, especially if it seems like I've been poor-mouthing stories all along. And that suggestion is that we should continue to tell stories. We don't have any choice for storytelling animals. There's no opting out. And stories aren't just part of the problem. I think they're also at the heart of all the hopeful solutions. This is because stories really do have the special power people attribute to them, the special power to sort of bring us together. But only, this is the catch that people miss out on, I think, only if we can resist telling our stories in ways that are guaranteed not to work. If we actually want to build bridges of narrative across these big divides that separate us, rather than just blowing up the few bridges we have left, we must resist, above all, this powerful, giddy, deeply human temptation to tell stories where we're the good people, the heroes, and the people on the other side of the divide are the two-dimensional villains in our morality tales. And right now, I think this is what we're all doing. Left, right, doesn't matter. We are villainizing each other in the crudest and most primitive ways. And these villain narratives can thrill the in-group. They can really motivate an in-group, but they are not a recipe for social progress. They're not a recipe for the kind of political compromise a democracy needs to actually pass any legislation, to actually do anything. I fear that it's a recipe for prosecuting a cold civil war of storytelling that is threatening more and more to escalate towards something hot if we don't kind of cut this crap out. And if we can do these things, if we can just sort of de-escalate, I think the story of the future can be more like the story told by Claire. One where if we don't get to live happily ever after, at least maybe we don't get eaten by monsters or wild animals at the end. So thank you so much for your attention. If you have any easy questions for me, I'll try to answer them. Thank you, thank you. Whoa. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
So I have a question about the animation experiment.
Yes, of course, yes.
So when it was presented to us, it was presented as geometry drama.
Oh,
how was
yeah.
it presented
I shouldn't have done that.
How was it presented to the people?
Not that.
Okay.
Not that. That was thank you for pointing that out, actually. I would absolutely cut that out. Because you're right, it totally biases the experiment.
Yeah. Okay,
It was not done that way.
Okay.
Thank you, very good point. And I will delete that immediately, because I shouldn't have done that. You're right. It's very difficult, in fact, to run this experiment in a way that's clean, because almost everyone in my audience knows I'm there to talk about storytelling, and so they're sort of biased from the start. But in the original experiment, it wasn't even about storytelling. As I said in my class today, it was about inference. How do people infer people's intentions and thoughts without language? So, like, the example I gave, so if I give a side eye to Joan right now, how does she interpret it? How does she make meaning out of it? That's what Heider-Simmel were after. It was only decades later that people said, oh, this kind of has some relevance to storytelling. But wonderful point, thank you. Anybody else? Don't be shy, but if you're tired, me too, we can quit.
Thank you very much for this. I think my question is it a little facile to posit an artificial dichotomy between an us and a them, and we have to engage ourselves and not make our narratives about us and them, when this dichotomy is set up by sort of a 1% class that is able to exist specifically because we're too busy using and theming.
Yeah.
And so suggesting that we're complicit in containing this struggle, it doesn't seem to do justice to the storytellers I know who really want to bring people out of it, but should still be crystally clearly able to call out fascism when they see it.
Yeah. I have my own politics, and I am concerned, and I'm often pretty angry. What I'm interested in myself is in what actually works in persuading people. And one example that comes to mind for me is a movie that I saw recently that I thought had tremendous potential to do a tremendous amount of good in the world, and almost certainly backfired. And the film was called Don't Look Up on Netflix. And Don't Look Up is a political film. It wants to entertain us, it wants to engage us, but it really wants to spread a political message about COVID, but especially about climate change. It wants to convince people that we're really behaving stupidly and the world is going to end unless we get control of ourselves. And this is a message that I completely agree with. It's right in my wheelhouse. But I'm the choir, preaching to the choir. Who do you actually need to convince in this film? Not me. You need to convince the people in the red hats. And instead of, and what they did was they made the villains the people in the red hats. And they just turned it off. So the problem is when you, the only role you will allow the opposition in your story is the role of Voldemort, is of the bad guy, of the villain. People will refuse to play that role. They'll say, no, I'm not going to enter into this story. I'm not going to be part of this. I'm going to make up my own story, and you will be Voldemort. So there was a different way of telling this story that I think would have been more practical and would have had good effects. The villains, so Meryl Streep plays Donald Trump, basically. Yeah. So, but what they could have done is it's had a Democratic president. We're Democrats not complicit in global climate change. We're not Democratic administrations complicit in all of this. And so the messaging would have been more effective, I think, if they would have left the red hats out of it. But the filmmakers were so angry that they couldn't help shoot themselves in the foot. And they also couldn't do without the comedic possibilities of making fun of Trump and people in red hats. It's just too tempting. But I think it was a failure in the sense that they really wanted to make a movie that would change the world, and it didn't. They just preached to the choir. So I am less interested in the rights and wrongs of things than in the question of sort of practically how do we make the world a better place. And I think when it feels good to shout fascist at people, but I don't think it does any good, except just kind of fill us with rage, and they say, no, you're the fascist. That's my own view, yeah. Anybody else?
You're describing, the stories that you're describing feel simplistic to me, and I feel like maybe the best stories are the ones with a great deal of nuance and psychological depth, where the characters are good and bad, and so how do you fit that?
I totally agree. I think I said early on that these are sort of, this is a sort of rough structure of what a story looks like, and maybe sort of a primeval Platonic form of what a story looks like. But yeah, I think that there's, of course, this is an oversimplification, and there's many exceptions to these rules. What's interesting to me is, what do the most influential stories look like, the most powerful stories? So if you have a sort of audience of like really educated people and sophisticated people, maybe they'll say like, well, my favorite novel is Gravity's Rainbow. It's really hard, it's really complicated, it's really sophisticated, but ordinary people can't read it. What actually do ordinary people consume? They're consuming stories that fit pretty nicely into that narrative. Genre fiction fits that basic structure. Every superhero film, mostly, will fit that structure. But I completely agree with you that is an oversimplification. But the question is, still at the end, even if you have a sort of nuanced story, what I like, let me see if I can get back to the beginning of this thing so we can look at. Let's see if I can get back to this diagram here. Where is it? Oh, yeah. So, is that going to work? Anyway, you saw the thing. This is what's happening to me all the time now. I'm just failing technologically at everything. But what you have in that triangle, it's called Karpman's triangle, is basically a sort of stripped down, simplified version of a Platonic form of a story. And what I think that it does get right about most storytelling is, as soon as you have the villain in there, you have a morality tale. You have a clash of values between the good guys and the bad guys. And it's very hard for storytellers, even the sophisticated ones, to escape that. At the end of the story, stories are usually kind of against something and for something morally. And again, you're smart, I'm sure, and really well educated, and you'll be able to bludgeon your memory banks and come up with exceptions to these rules. But I think there's sort of exceptions that prove the rule. They're sort of statistical outliers, and they tend to be most attractive to, again, a narrow slice of educated and sophisticated people, whereas most people like the hardcore morality tale structure. But I certainly agree with you about, this is. I needed a lot of caveats to say, plenty of exceptions to these rules. I saw a hand over here, though. Justin, yeah.
Do you think there's a connection between our simplistic understanding of...
Wait for the mic, yeah.
Do you think there's a connection between our simplistic understanding of, like the way we simplify characters in story and the way that our language works? Like how our language tends to prefer yeses and nos, or binary answers, good, bad, male, female. Do you think there's a connection between those two? Because everything starts as a script, right? So we start with language, or...
That's a great question. One thing I've learned in situations like this is, if I don't know the answer, I'm just going to, if I don't have any idea about an answer, I'm not going to just dig myself into a hole hoping that an answer pops out of my face. So I don't know, but that's interesting. Let's think about that in class on Monday. Anybody else want to take some swings at the piñata? No more from you. There's other hands. There's other hands.
Pinata, we're not adversaries.
I know. I was joking. I was joking.
You're imposing your own artificial dichotomy of you're in a villain. But we're like behind you because we came to your talk.
I was joking. Okay.
I'm
just saying there were some other hands. Yeah.
Sorry. So this is piggybacking off of the previous two questions, and also, so this might be a hard question. So I work in medical advertising, and there's an inherent disconnect there because medicine and facts are so hard to communicate because they're complex.
I'm sorry, I'm missing you a little bit. You work in what?
I work in medical advertising, so
Okay.
there's a little bit of a tension because medicine and facts are so hard to communicate, just like the news, because it's so nuanced and complex. Yet people, advertising is created so that people can digest things very, very quickly in small bits because people don't have very long attention spans these days. So I'm wondering how story can be utilized to kind of like reconcile the fact that sometimes we have to communicate really, really complicated things, like things in the news, science, versus the fact that people don't have the attention span these days to listen and gravitate to simplistic narratives.
Yeah. So you're wondering how if story is the medium that can be used to communicate that stuff, or you don't think it's up to it?
I mean, I would like to know if story has that potential, and I think it does.
Yeah, I think it does. There's a fairly entrenched and powerful movement within medicine to communicate in terms of stories because they do solve some of the problems you talk about, where they carry a lot of information. They carry the information in a sort of memorable way, and they do engage attention better than, for instance, just throwing out statistics about what your odds of survival are or whatever. Anything else? So you guys can have another question, yeah.
Well, oh wait. This is actually just a follow-up to kind of the previous couple questions. So which do you think is the better strategy then for addressing this issue? Is the better strategy to craft better stories within that basic structure, or to teach more story literacy at a younger age so people engage with story differently?
Both, I suppose, right? I mean, is there a reason it can't be both?
No.
So I would say both. Part of what I'm saying is, I agree with you. This is a brutal simplification, and I don't want stories to be told this way. So to the extent that stories are told this way, I think this is a brutal simplification and something that should be avoided. And I do think if you structure things this way, you end up with an us-them narrative that is unhelpful. And as I was saying to people in my class, I'd kind of like just for this to happen. You just get rid of that guy. And you can still have a person who's causing trouble, but try to have some sympathy for this person. What made this person a villain, or what made them behave antisocially or whatever. There's a film that I like a lot that just came to mind, Babel. You ever see Babel? Babel is it's a Brad Pitt film, and who else is in it? I don't know, but it's a really great film. Who's seen Babel? I'm going to do a horrible plot summary of it now, but it's basically a story where you have an incredibly problem-drenched film, where it's a big cast, and all the characters are coping with horrendous life and threatening problems the whole time. It's just conflict and trouble and from beginning to end, and everyone is suffering and going through hard things. And there's just no villain. There's no bad guys in the story to make it all happen. And there's a sort of truth to that in some ways that strikes me as more truthful about what life is actually like. That bad things often happen without bad people to cause them. And Babel ends up being a very, very humane sort of story, where there's still a sort of message, and I think it's a message that people in this room would agree with. But it doesn't call upon a sort of primitive psychology of hating a bad guy and wanting to see them, either killed or imprisoned or humiliated in horrifying ways. It's able to do all that work without summoning up the monsters. Did you want to say anything else? Oh.
I'm trying really hard not to pinata stick this. No, it's just that when you talk to the next generation of storytellers and creators,
yeah,
the truth of the matter is that if authoritarian regimes, don't call them villains, but if democracy is unbridled, it's the storytellers and the artists who get shoved in the cattle cars first, unless they're saved to set up a model ghetto like Theresienstadt, since you're talking about Tree of Life. Yeah. And so enabling people, if the most direct and effective stories, is what you're saying on one hand, do have this primitive structure, asking people to make more nuanced stories or to eliminate that, it kind of takes one of the biggest quivers out of their arrows out of their quiver.
I see what you're saying.
When these are the people who are going to be most at risk for doing what they do.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. I see what you're saying. I take your point. I really do. It's a good point. Again, I think what you're saying is, like, let's say the authoritarians are telling stories in this way. It's a very, very powerful, very, very crude sort of messaging. So I hate to do this, but to say the name that should not be spoken, but Trump, he's telling a story that is very powerful, and it seethes with primitive emotion. And it's very simple. You repeat it over and over again. It's called MAGA or something like that. And it's the idea that the greatest nation on earth fell into decadence and corruption, and we just need this culture hero to come swagger on the scene and to save us and return us to an age of gold. And if they're going to tell stories like that, we can't de-escalate. Or not we, but people on the other side can't de-escalate and do without the sort of primitive emotions that this can instigate, and the power. We saw the power that this story instigates. You see these rallies, they're quite chilling, and you can see that this is really quite electrifying. And it's so electrifying that he lures tens of millions of cognitively, apparently healthy people into a delusional alternative reality of QAnonism and big lieism and every other sort of craziness. So you may be right. You may be right. I'm not dogmatic about this. I certainly don't think that I have all the answers to this at all. My own feeling is that yelling at each other hasn't done any good. And I feel like Don't Look Up I almost cried afterwards. I thought it was such a disaster, because it was a wonderful opportunity to have a huge, big budget film with Leonardo DiCaprio in it. And I feel like the way they just alienated all the people they needed to persuade. And so I do think that the messaging has to be a little more canny and a little more intelligent than it usually is. But I think that's enough for me. I'm tired. I'm sure you guys are. And I really want to thank you guys for your time and attention. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.